I wish I could say top of the morning to you guys, but what I'll just say is hello. Budget night was last night, and it's been a tougher budget than any that I've watched or talked about or done a webinar with Mike on, and I think it's a tough day for a lot of people in our community. So what we wanted to do, rather than bring you our market update, is come through with a budget update and get this out to you as soon as possible so that you've got some insights from how we've distilled it and also some clarity around the policy changes. So I'm proud to be the host and also feeling a tad disappointed today. I think that's understandable, don't you guys?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's pretty much come out as they'd flagged the budget, so there wasn't really surprises other than they've actually followed through with particularly the negative gearing, ending negative gearing on established properties, which is a humongous change to the property finance economic landscape in Australia, and obviously will have a sizable impact on many businesses, whether they're in the property space, mortgage space, or what have you. So that, that is certainly unfortunate and something that, we can unpack. But the impact on future aspirational young people, and we can look at how that might play out in real terms and really try and unpack our thoughts on what just transpired last night in the budget.
Yeah, well said, Dave. Mike, I'm going to start with you. I want to unpack the two property related significant changes and just explain in detail what the policies are. So we'll start with negative gearing. And I'd love you to talk us through what the plan is, what the new regime will be, when it kicks in, what the grandfathering is, just so that we've got clarity on the policy itself before we distill what we think about the policy change.
Yeah, sure. As Dave said, if you own an investment property on budget night already, you still have those negative gearing deductions in perpetuity. So if you are buying a property today before the 1st of July 2017, you'll have until then to negatively gear it, and then it's absolutely gone. If you're buying anything that's not brand new after the 1st of July 2027, there'll be no negative gearing losses to offset against your income. If you buy a brand new property, either you did it yesterday, you do it today, you do it a year from now, you'll still be able to claim negative gearing and be able to pick your CGT discount. What it is today, the 50% CGT discount for 12 months, or an indexation method. And that'll be some detailed modelling you'll need to do with your accountant.
Yeah, and look, the accountants are even saying it's heavily detailed. I want to just step back a little bit, and what I'd love us to be able to do today is fill in some of the gaps. I've had lots and lots of questions since last night, and you gave us a very thorough rundown of the changes to negative gearing, Mike. Let's talk about the nitty-gritty. So you said if you own, or if you hold a property. Now, a lot of people ask me about whether you have to have owned the property so it's settled and it's yours and it's in your name, or do you have to have secured a property with a signed contract before 7:30 p.m. last night? Now, typically these things are based on the contract date, the date of sale.
Yeah, we don't have all of the documentation yet, so it's a little bit of conjecture, but the way it's worked in the past is exchanging contracts before budget night, specifically the exact moment where the Treasurer gets up to speak. So if you've exchanged a contract prior to 7:30 p.m. on the 12th of May 2026, you will be grandfathered with negative gearing. What we don't necessarily know is, let's say you own an owner-occupier and you start renting it out tomorrow. Will you only have until the 1st of July for the negative gearing, or because you've owned it prior to that, will it go in perpetuity? Normally what has happened in the past is it needs to be an income producing asset before that date.
Yeah, and these are the technicalities that we'll get some clarification on. They're the questions that people are asking. And it's interesting, I had a client sell a property actually yesterday at 6:40 something. I was just jumping on the show with you when that contract came through, and you look at situations like that and, you know, by the skin of your nose, you've just managed to get a contract executed without knowing what was about to unfold at 7:30. But I digress. I also want to talk about the negative gearing on established property is not something that you can now, so the deductions can't be claimed against your income any longer. However, the losses can be carried forward. So,
Yes.
Mike, I
So-
want you to detail how that works. Or actually, Dave, let's get you to jump in.
Yeah, so look, I mean that's how certain. So that's how a trust works. Basically, is you aren't able to claim the losses whilst they're occurring. So obviously, it's an impact on your cash flow. So what that means is, as the losses build up over time, it's not until the property starts to becoming cash flow positive that then you won't be paying tax on the positive income that you're earning down the track, because it'll be actually offset against your previous losses. So for those people who are actually able to hold property through a period of it losing money, because that's what negative gearing is, and I feel like that's going to be much clearer to a lot of people who just thought it was this concept that provided you with an advantage to get into real estate over other asset classes. Well, no, they'll start to I think they'll start to understand better what it is. It's actually a circumstance where you claim the losses because you're actually making a cash flow loss, which you're able to do, by the way, on every other, basically every other type of investment. You can still negatively gear debt on a business. You can still negatively gear against shares or ETFs or even cryptocurrency if you're borrowing against it, for example, but you just cannot on properties. Yep. So what that means is you might lose cash flow of, say, $10,000 of your deductible holding costs on a investment property. So let's say your rent was $10,000, your interest and other deductible holding costs are $20,000, your cash flow loss is $10,000. You've got to fork that out from your own cash flow. So in effect, it makes holding on to an established investment property much harder. And what that'll mean is, the reality is, less people will buy established investment properties. So that is the primary change that's occurred with this budget.
Yeah, without a doubt. Now, let's talk about the comment that you've just made, Dave. And I don't think anyone could accuse us of saying that out of, you know, any sense of self-gain or you know, any agenda. It is very obvious that there's not a lot of incentive now for an investor to target an established property. And being the finance guy in the room, I would imagine that today you and your team will be very busy with lenders sending through their new servicing regimes for investment servicing calculators. And what I mean by that is, when you put together a loan for a client and it's an investment property, the lenders understand negative gearing and they incorporate that in their servicing calculation. So in other words, they're taking some of that into account to formulate a position on how much they're prepared to lend an investor. And that will change. So even if someone wanted to go down the established property route, there will be a lot of investors that have significantly less power in their servicing
capacity.
than what they would have for a brand new property.
Yeah. Look, I mean, you're probably giving lenders more credit than they deserve. I don't think they'll be that rapid in getting through their serviceability calculators, but it's a really good point you make. It's going to impact borrowing capacities for investors, and you're actually going to need to probably, it's going to be interesting to see how they do it, because negatively geared obviously is still available on new property. So you potentially need to nominate, actually, as I just think it through, you know, when you're doing your loan application, whether you plan to buy new or established. And if you're going to buy new, then your serviceability will probably be higher. And there might be a serviceability calculator that, well, they'll build it into the calculations. You'll click a button that says new property and it'll be factored in, and established, and it probably won't be. Yeah, look, I mean, we've been talking, you know, I've spoken about it in our refinancing episode. We've been communicating with our client base how people's borrowing capacities are already reducing with the rising interest rates. And now
Yes.
that's going to take another hit for anyone who is looking to purchase established investment properties. But as I just mentioned, it's fair to say those numbers are going to, at least initially, dwindle to a fair degree, I'd say.
And Mike, what do you think this means for established property in the investor space? When I say the investor space, typically investors, the bulk of them aren't really going over $1 million. I certainly meet investors that might want to spend 1.5 or 2, but they're few and far between in the scheme of things. What do you think it means for the sub-$1 million established house market?
Yeah, well, I think the wealth gap just got wider, really, because if we think about people that are serial investors in established property, they need negative gearing deductions a lot less than, say, the new investors. So what is ostensibly now going to happen is that if you're buying an established investment property and it's in a negative cash flow position, as would be the vast majority of property under a normal LVR, it means you can't offset those losses immediately. Of course, yes, they become quarantined and we can offset them when we sell the property, but property investors need access to that cash flow in the beginning. I've always said the hardest time to own an investment property is day one. It only gets easier over time, especially if you're paying down the principal, but over time you should expect the rents to increase. No matter what the market is, you can sort of guarantee that in 20 years' time the rents are going to be higher than what they are today. So that cash flow differential, taking it away from the front end and giving it to the back end, I feel disproportionately harms those less financially well off. And of course, we've got baby boomers sailing off into the sunset with grandfathered negative gearing in perpetuity. I mean, it begs the question, what problem are we trying to solve with this budget? And I just kind of think for those people that are saving for a deposit, they're now having to be in a rental pool with diminished serviceability and diminished cash flow for established investors. I can't see how their modelling of $2 a week increase in rent is going to be anything other than a fiction.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Now, it's interesting that you talk about the disproportionate opportunity within the investment, stratosphere. We've got emerging investors who are probably in their 30s, most likely, but sometimes it'll be in their 20s. I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with very young investors. Then you've got your really seasoned investors or your investors that are approaching retirement and, they've got it sorted out. Let's talk about the negative gearing being grandfathered. They would have done their numbers on it. And we've chatted about this many other times. Investors that have been in the market for quite a while, they don't need negative gearing benefits because they're not dealing with negative cash flow. When you're holding a property, and I don't want to put a number of years on it as a hard and fast rule because everyone's different. Every person's ability to pay down debt is different. But if you're not making extra repayments and you're using your offset wisely and you've got a capital growth asset, you should be reaching net cash flow neutral around the 15-year mark, maybe earlier. And obviously the magnitude of the debt and the rental yield plays a huge role in that calculation. But once you've had a property for a couple of decades, unless you've been refinancing it and not managing your debt, you'll probably find that you are cash flow neutral. And they would have done the numbers and looked at the older generation, the older cohort, and the word negative gearing abolishment freaks out a lot of people. So if they've just applied this blanket, we've got a lot of investors who have purchased in the last 10 years that will absolutely need it, but we've got a lot of investors that purchased 10 to 50 years ago that don't need it. So I think it was a clever calculation on their part. I hate it. And I think the aspiring investors are the real losers in all of this. And we'll break that down a bit further.
And it's not just property too. Like the old rules that the boomer generation had was a lower capital gains tax environment. Now there's a higher tax on profits for any particular asset. So it has shifted the goalposts to a rather large degree, and that's why I believe that that's just going to exacerbate that wealth gap. We aren't able to do what we were able to do, 10, 20 years ago anymore.
Yeah. Like if we look at, for example, capital gains tax. So, low capital gains tax encourages investment, it encourages startups. it causes talent to come to your country or leave your country. And, we've now moved to a minimum capital gains tax rate of 30%, which is really high by international standards. And if I just compare it to a few other countries, like in Singapore, it's zero. Now, Singapore is this tiny, little piece of land that doesn't have all the natural resources we have. It doesn't have all the advantages we have as a country, yet it's a highly successful country because of the way it runs its economy. And one of the things it does has, as I just said, CGT at 0%. Now, there's going to be young up and coming Australians who would be starting businesses and professionals, and they're gonna look to leave Australia, and that talent drain has a real impact on your country. We just have to look across the ditch. New Zealand has a zero CGT rate in nearly all cases. You can jump over there and pay next to, or basically zero capital gains tax on most assets that you sell. Even China, the sort of leading communist nation in the world, guess what its CGT rate is? Do you guys know?
Yeah, it was
It's
like
around
1 point something
20%.
percent. Okay, I've got that wrong.
Yeah, so it's around 20-ish percent. USA is 15%. So yeah, I mean that is a concern, but investment leaving Australia, talent leaving Australia, businesses building wealth elsewhere. I mean, people have to understand that capital is mobile. Money moves to places where it thinks it can earn more income or create more wealth. And so that's going to be part of the fallout here too.
Yeah, that's a huge one, Dave. Like the incentive to start and grow a business in Australia has diminished. It's going to be disastrous, I think, for productivity and for aspiration. And I think if we are trying to head towards a recession, it was a great move. And on another point too, and this was something that, Cate, last night we were talking to Jeremy Yanazelli, the accountant, and he flagged something unusual that has hallmarks of COVID disaster response, and that's that small businesses with a turnover under $10 million that are making a loss in the future will be able to offset that against potentially tax payable in previous financial years to stop basically businesses going under. And if we think about property and property services, like we had lots of mining ads in previous elections where it's like mining employs, so much of the country, so we shouldn't have this big, carbon tax or that sort of stuff. Property employs a hell of a lot more people than mining does. Property and property services and ancillary things. A lot of these things are kind of fed by property investors as well. Things like repairs and maintenance and improvements, these are either immediately deductible or they can be depreciated over their effective life. Those things now can't be claimed in the immediate sense. They can be captured and offset on future gains, but the incentive to improve, to maintain a property over and above the minimum standards isn't there. So it's going to be a far-reaching consequence to property and ancillary property services, I believe.
Yeah, 100%. I remember, and I can't remember, but there was something happening or some concerns about something to do with the property market. And earlier episodes prior to your days, Mike, and I shared that I think 1 in every 3 jobs in Australia has some linkage to property. So, and that was like using that sort of analogy that property is too big to fail because it just impacts too much of the economy. And I can't remember what the context was, why I was talking about that in the episode. But I think as these policy changes gradually weave their way into the economy, the negative impacts to the economy are going to become so clear that I just feel like it's going to need to be repealed at some point. Now, a Labor government is really not going to want to do that. But we know, Paul Keating, when he abolished negative gearing about, what would that be now?
1985.
1985?
87 is when they abolished it. They introduced it about 20 months earlier.
So we're pretty much 4 decades on. Labor are pulling out a very similar policy. That took 2 years to get repealed, and Paul Keating has a big ego, but he still turned it over. Just, and I've got an example that I can just talk through about, just one example of how it's going to impact the economy. So Treasury has estimated that property value prices will grow at 2% less. Okay, so 2% less per annum doesn't sound like much, does it? But as our long-term listeners will know, the power of compounding is incredibly powerful. So what I did is I just looked at a property purchase today worth $500,000. Now, if that property for potentially previous generations, everyone who's purchased property and been able to own it over previous decades, over 30 years growing at 6%, that property would be worth $2.87 million. Now, if it's growing at 4% per annum, so I've tried to use realistic values relative to historic prices, that property is only going to be worth $1.62 million. So that's $1.25 million less of wealth creation just with that 2% less annual growth over time. And so this is where the housing debate becomes incredibly complicated, but politically and economically. But, slowing property growth may help some younger Australians buy sooner initially. And that's a small cohort of the whole voting population and adult population. But as soon as they buy, they now become property owners. So then they're starting to pay a price for less growth in their major asset. Australia's entire wealth system is heavily tied to residential property. So, for decades, we've saved through property, we've retired through property, we've borrowed against property, we've funded businesses through property equity. It's very hard to do it any other way. And we pass wealth through property. And 2 out of 3 first home buyers are actually getting gifts from their parents to help them get into their first property because their parents have grown wealth through property and high productivity, etc. So in Australia, it isn't just a shelter anymore, and probably in a lot of other countries as well. It is a primary part of the balance sheet for your average household. So if we structurally reduce the long-term property growth, we're not just reducing investor profits, we're not just incentivizing it. It will help more new property. I do think what they've done would help more new properties to be built. So it will help supply at some degree, but we're reducing household wealth creation across generations. And, that's the irony. Today's first home buyer is tomorrow's property owner. So the policies designed to help them get in will eventually reduce their wealth accumulation of the exact same property people, for the exact asset class that they then want to grow in value. So I think it's going to have a huge impact on our economy, and it's going to feed through to so many other aspects with business, jobs, and it's going to push up rents as well, I believe, and really just ultimately weaken the engine and have these broader economic consequences. That's my
very good take, I think, Dave. And the RBA's own data shows that about 70% of household wealth is in residential property, right? So we've got new first home owners who will become property owners, and they can expect that asset to grow slower than it has in the past. And the people that aren't buying a home, that are renting, can expect a lesser rental pool and an increase in rents. So if you don't buy a home, you can expect to pay more rent. If you buy a home, you can expect it to grow more modestly than it has under previous tax settings. So there's no win that I can see either way. And that's before we talk about the far-reaching economic impacts of this higher tax, higher spending environment.
Yeah. Well, if you touch on some of those, if your property isn't growing at the same rate, there ends up being weaker consumption, which harms the economy. It harms businesses that need you to go and spend and buy their products and services. It means lower business investment. And one of the fundamental part, which I already just touched on, is people borrow against their homes and their investment properties to get into business. There's going to be less capacity to do that. All this will impact productivity. There's going to be less retirement security, as you just noted, that most people, like there's a huge, most people rely on their home to a fair degree, or property, to fund their help fund their retirement. And this is all going to drive weaker living standards. And it's actually the people it's trying to help, it's going to make it harder for them to grow wealth once they own a property. Sure, for a little period, it makes it easier for them to buy property, but or ongoing for that little period of their life, those people in the phase about to buy property, it will make it a bit easier for them to buy property. We're already doing that, making it reasonably easy to buy property for a whole range of reasons. The government 5% boost, being able to borrow to 95%, the myriad of lender choice, 2 out of 3 Australians are being helped by parents. Like, it isn't actually harder to get into the property market. You do have to borrow more, and the cost of the asset is greater. We have more dual incomes than we ever had before, but it is going to have a real effect on future prosperity.
I agree. I was very surprised that they were so deliberate about first home buyer opportunity and that rhetoric that investors have been taking opportunity away from first home buyers. And I'm not denying that investors play a role in competition, but we've seen a dramatic increase in first home buyer lending over the past year. It's up 9.1% in 12 months, which is a dramatic turnaround. And to your point, Dave, that 5% deposit guarantee has made an enormous difference, and it's opened a lot of floodgates. Now, the interesting thing that I can't get my head around is this magic number of 75,000. I want to know where it's stemming from. And there's an inference that
what number
established housing, 75,000 new first home buyers over the next 10 years will have an opportunity.
75,000 more than would have otherwise?
That's right.
That's what they're saying? Right.
That's right. So there's an inference that established property will be closer to their grasp. What they haven't said is that for that to happen, established property would need to lose ground. It would need to lose value. Or in keeping parity with wages, or that the parity would need to enable it to be an easier grab for a first home buyer. Now, no one's going to go out to the Australian people and say, look, we need to see dwelling values decline to open up this opportunity. They didn't use those words at all. And I'd like to know how they think that they can help first home buyers many more, get into the market, when often first home buyer entry is determined by their ability to borrow. And hinging on that is their ability to save. Now, if these very first home buyers...
They've almost removed the requirement to save.
So you're saying to get the 5%, they can be gifted?
Yeah, you don't need much savings.
You don't need genuine savings?
Hardly.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens if you don't have a parent that's happy to give you a handout and you're renting and things are already tight? What happens?
Well, there's going to be some people who it's still going to remain difficult for. But the 5% boost has already made it much easier.
It's made a huge difference. And
I mean, that's what's caused this big bump
hard
in the numbers. And it's so early days. We've got rents flying again. They grew at another point. I know market updates next week, but they grew at another 0.6% last month. So that's up to an annualized 7.2%. I'm pretty sure the nation's rent over the last 12 months is up at high fives now. You've got rates going up, and now they're, throwing this into the equation.
Yeah, we've got a lot of commentary, and particularly, Mike and I are familiar with this. Pippa's got a grave concern for the rental market and the impact on renters. And I want to unpack that, because some people will stare me down and say that's wrong. There's no evidence to suggest that we'll see a rental shortage or that rents will go up, and, Treasury have modelled X, Y, Z. I don't trust Treasury's modelling, and we've seen many examples of them getting it wrong. And I want to remind people of what they predicted low interest rate environments would do during COVID and how wrong we got that. anyway, moving forward.
Well, yeah.
If we see, we've got this capital gains tax window where currently, if you want to sell an investment, you'll still be subject to that 50% capital gains tax discount. And that is until, well, it's more than a 12-month window.
Basically.
Yes, 13 and a half. And that finishes on the 1st of July 2027. So over the next 13 and a half months, is it fair to imagine that anyone who was thinking of selling in the next 5 or 10 years anyway, and I'm talking about people that have, reached the end of their property retirement journey and they're looking at retirement, they want to be less hands-on, they're willing to pay the CGT and then pop it into, super or shares where they're not paying land tax, they're not doing kitchen renovations, they're not dealing with property managers and tenants, there's no wear and tear. Like the tax issue is one thing, but the ease of managing the asset is another, and they no longer want to leverage. They don't need more lending. They don't want negative gearing in their life. They've got this bundle of cash and they want it to work for them. So anyone that was looking at doing that over the next 5 to 10 years, is it conceivable to think that there's a high likelihood many of them will be selling in the next 13 and a half months?
I think there's two mindsets. One is a bit like the GameStop diamond hands idea. It's like, I'm holding all the way to the end, right? Like, so you've got a negatively geared asset that stays negatively geared as long as you hold on.
Well, it's not negatively geared if you've paid it down.
About like
that's
ones
the thing.
Positively geared. They've got huge, big financial position. Look, there'll definitely be some who'll go, look, I'm going to pay more CGT if I hold it beyond July 1, 2027. But also, like I've just sort of worked through it and what Treasury modelled of 2% less capital growth on the property. Yes. So it's actually an asset class that I may not get, or I may not get as much growth on. That's another reason to sell it. So there's a fair chance that a reasonable chunk, so more people will sell over the next 12 months. Based on all the information we know at the moment from the budget.
And, some of them will be speculating that the property market could be, doing it tough for a little while. Let's get out now before the herd. Others will be thinking, I've got 13 and a half months to get this CGT at the 50% discount rate. Let's do it now. We were going to do it in a few years anyway. So my concern is that in a very short space of time, we will see an erosion of rental stock, established rental stock. And then we've got new aspiring investors fighting it out with first home buyers and anyone else who wants to buy, off the plan, new townhouse, whatever. And we've got building starts that are not looking great. And we've already seen exactly what sort of construction mess we're in with our National Housing Accord not keeping up with where it's meant to be at. So if we have a shortage of rental property, and of course we've got investors that are opting for a different asset class, we can expect to see less rental property over the next year and a half. I think it goes without
that's a very high likelihood that there's going to be diminished stock. I mean, if you have more first home buyers getting into the market, that's likely to reduce the number of investment properties than if you have more selling. But you have less buying established investment properties. So although I do think this will be good, I will say it, as I have said briefly already, I do think it will increase new supply.
It will.
But I think there are other ways. Well, and we can talk about that. We can go there later on, but just on this point, I do. So I think, it's going to, overall, there's going to be less rental properties. And I think that'll gradually become more and more apparent. I think rents will increase. And listening to a couple people last night who lived through what happened last time, it sounds like it was the media pressure that actually forced Keating to turn around because the outcomes were negative. The level of media pressure nowadays, I think is so much larger than it was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So
if we hurt tenants, we'll hear about it. We will absolutely hear about it.
Yeah.
Well, because Chalmers already said, like he mentioned protections for renters, right? So he's already telegraphing that there's probably headwinds for renters. So, putting something in place, I haven't seen the detail, to try and protect them is evidence that, well, they need protecting. But then we've also sort of seen that with some of the minimum standards legislation. Like, this might actually get to the point where the investors are seeing that and they're going, okay, well, this is just way too hard. I'm not interested in property anymore.
Yeah, well, look, Treasury estimated that it did estimate rents will increase. Did you hear by how much?
Well, $2 a week.
$2
right?
a week.
Yeah.
Yeah. $104 per annum. Not to be sneezed at for a renter. I mean, but it's a
So
tiny
they're saying
amount.
that rents are going to increase less at a lesser rate than what they're currently tracking at. Is that what they're saying? Because our rate of increase is far greater than that at the moment.
Yeah, I'd say like $2 extra on top of what it would have otherwise, which is, say, at the moment it's 5.7% over the last 12 months. $2 extra on top of that. That sounds pretty hopeful.
What I do want to talk about is the exception to the negative gearing change, and that is new property. And Dave, I want to chat with you about why we think this is a bad idea when we're putting our advisor hat on, why we think it's really bad luck for emerging investors to be now weighing up whether they'd want to buy a brand new property when previously we would have steered them away from that.
Yeah, so look, I mean, well, for a long time, we've been educating investors on the risks of purchasing new property and why they tend to underperform. And we've dedicated in terms of capital growth. And we've dedicated a couple episodes to this. So might insert those episode numbers here in a post-recording. And I'm sure it'll be in episodes to listen to at the end if hang around to the end, and Anne-Marie will tell you. But long story short, if you know, like the analogies use, a new property is full of, firstly, the actual materials used to build a new property only cost perhaps 50% of the price you're paying, because you're paying, you know, perhaps up to 50%, give or take, of the cost in labor, you know, so the builder, the tradesman, their profits, the developer's profits. So first you've got to wrap your head around, like, you know, you're paying $1 million for something, but the materials themselves might cost $500,000. Okay, so therefore, what happens when you buy anything new? It's going backwards in value the moment you use it. So if you break it down to individual items, which is a way I always found like it was easier for people to understand, like the moment you buy an oven, its value's depreciated as soon as, you know, you put it in the house, let alone once you've used it, etc. Now that's happening to every single aspect of a new house. Okay. Now, so think of a doorknob, whatever you like. So basically, that's why you're able to claim depreciation. And, you know, you should go and speak to Mike and his team at MC Quantity Surveyors if you haven't already. You're able to claim depreciation because the actual value of the house and its bits and pieces that go into it are going backwards. So end result, the overall dwelling asset value tends to go backwards. Now, it's probably, we've found tracking new property probably not until somewhere around 5 to 10 years does it go through enough of a depreciation that its value starts to lift. Now, being conscious that the primary part of a property that is growing in value is the land. And now often, well, you know, you might have apartments that are new, so it's only a notional piece of land in the sky often that has some value that's growing. And so you've got these competing forces of the actual dwelling itself. Well, it's new, it's going backwards, everything's getting older, getting dated, looking uglier, moving towards a place of, okay, that can't get any worse, or ultimately to a place where it gets, some things need to be replaced. And then it starts to hit an equilibrium. Okay, and then with natural inflation, at some point, those costs might start to level out, and actually the dwelling might provide some growth, you know, but ultimately it's the land basically that will be providing the growth for you. So what is now going to happen is more and more people will be tipped into, as investors, sold on the idea of buying new because they can negatively gear it. They'll be shown, like they've already been sold to historically, very well. Here's all your depreciation deductions. Here's your rent. And, whoever's selling it will say, look, here's what the property will be worth on average price growth in 10 years' time. The problem is that often they won't grow at that rate. And there's heaps and heaps of examples. If you just go and look at, anywhere where there's a high supply of new homes or apartments, and you look at the resale values, particularly when they're homogenous style properties, in
Yes.
after 3, 5, 7 years, you'll often see the prices are still below. And there's heaps and heaps. You Google it, look it up, you'll find lots of people who can show you examples of these. But also what happens is, because the property industry isn't regulated like, say, the share market, people hide sale values, particularly the people who have a vested interest. So you often won't be able to find sale values when the sale price is much lower than the original new purchase price as well. So it is harder to find that data. Therefore, that data is harder to track. It's less obvious. But if you look hard enough, you can find, and it's not to say every single new property won't grow in value. Some will have special attributes, but that is the high risk.
I think that's a great point that you make. And, Dave, we've been in this business, Mike as well. You say you do valuations all the time. The bespoke stuff, the well-constructed stuff, the well-located stock, the properties in particular where a marketer is not getting a disproportionate commission structure. And so I want to break this down. I've helped people buy, new semi-detached, nicely styled new townhouses. You can get some beauties, and their land to asset ratio isn't as high as I'd like it if it was established, which means in its early years, it will underperform a little bit when contrasted against a similar sized dwelling in the same area on the same block of land. However, they're not dogs of properties if they're unique enough or well constructed enough. But the critical thing that buyers need to be aware of is how much commission they're paying. And when you're dealing with high-rise properties and high stock turnover developers and introducers that are slick, you do tend to find that you're paying much more that's wrapped up invisibly in a sale price that's really hard to cross-check against other sales, as Dave said. And you can be paying a massive premium. Now, this might shock listeners. I get approached all the time by developers flogging new stuff, and it's an easy delete. I don't buy new, and I'm not interested, and I don't like buying off a stock list. I go through real estate agents. Now, when a real estate agent sells a property, whether it's established or brand new, they're generally getting somewhere between 1.5% and 2% as their sales commission. I get notices, I get emails from developers offering up to 8% for me to introduce a new property to a client. Now, if they're buying a property that has my 8% wrapped up in it, they're paying at the very least 8% too much. And the valuers know it. When the product is complete and ready to settle, the bank sends a valuer, they know exactly what's happened and the person has made too much. And I think that kind of behaviour is the biggest risk with this change that our government's introduced. And we will see a rise of introducers and marketers. And I think it's really important to make sure they're not a spruiker.
It was already risky, right? But there's an extra element of risk now because, if you think about the metaphor of buying a brand new car, as soon as you drive it off the lot, it's lost a huge amount of value. That doesn't work exactly the same in real estate. Like, all of Dave's points are correct. Your points I completely agree with. But let's just say it's an infill new build and it's worth $1 million. If you sell it 6 months later, it's not going to be worth $700,000 like a new car might depreciate. But what we're talking about is a brand new property with certain tax settings, and the moment it becomes second hands, they're different tax settings. So it's less advantageous to be that second owner. So the differential between new and established is now wider. So if you are buying a new property, all those risks still exist. There'll be a gold rush. I feel like more people will be harmed by this, and the government really hasn't addressed that in any meaningful way. And by the time that you go to sell it, it won't be worth as much because it's not treatable in the same tax way as when you bought it.
It's a really critical point, which I should have mentioned. You
There's
buy
so
it new,
much to unpack, isn't there?
and then when you go to sell, it's now established. So
It's
there's
tainted.
there will, with the new tax settings, be a much smaller segment of people who are interested to buy that property. That's the reality. That's what's been created.
Yeah. It's like buying
it actually makes the outcomes even greater risk. One other point I'll quickly make, which I've always made about property, is because you're not seeing the share price every day, people take a much longer period of time to realize and understand when they've purchased a bad asset, because the actual understanding of how their price point is stagnant or has gone backwards happens over years generally. Okay, so people, and also what I've seen play out is people will put their head in the sand for quite a while, hoping it'll come good. So this can hurt people for a long period of time when you have a poorly performing property asset. It's also why this policy might last a bit longer, because the mass realization of what's happening to these types of assets in terms of their growth may not play out through mainstream media for a longer period of time. But I still think probably the economy slowing down, the impact on jobs, the rental increases, I think they'll play out faster and will still probably, become clearer even before the people who happen to jump in and buy these new properties and don't realize till 5 years later that they've bought a dud. That's going to play out over a longer period of time. It always has.
Time will really tell, won't it? Because we still don't have the detailed exposure draft. It has to get through the upper and lower houses. Liberal are saying that, sure, we'll repeal it, but our first port of call is to stop this from actually being legislated. So we really don't know what will happen. And if this does become legislation and we are post 1 July 2027, of course, tune into the Property Trio. We'll keep you abreast of what's happening in the data. And it'll be a little while before we see any data that is influenced by this, like consumer sentiment in the market update we're going to share next week. I kind of feel like that's the whole world has changed since then. So there's a lot that we don't know yet, but of course we'll guide you through it as best we can.
As we come to the end of this, we've been chatting now for nearly 50 minutes, so it's a corker of an episode. Got a political question for you, and I know we've got to stay in our lane and talk about property. What do you think the fundamental basis was for our government to decide not to apply the negative gearing changes to commercial property or shares?
I think because, sorry, Dave, I'll let you go first.
No, you go.
I think you can't live in a share and you can't live in a commercial property, and that's a huge fundamental difference. And I think if we're talking about politics, millennials outnumber baby boomers at the ballot box. So this is a political budget rather than a long-term economic prosperity one.
Yeah.
My thoughts exactly.
Yeah, basically agree. Yeah. I mean, it's politics. They see this as helping a bigger cohort of voting base. But also there's a lot of Gen Xers or baby boomers who feel like it is hard, and it is hard for the younger generation in certain ways, but there are a lot of ways that they've been helped, which I think ultimately it's hardest for single first-time buyers who are single and have no help from parents. That's the cohort that we should be targeting in some regard, and actually don't target, anyone else just about to assist.
Yep. And back to the supply versus demand challenge. We've got to address supply, but when you're circling in on a group like that, really the only way to do it is by creating an ability, a greater demand or a greater success rate for those people, which is on the demand side of things, because it's, incentives and opportunity. And one last question for you both, which is about the electorate and how we perceive trust. And I was listening to a clever interview this morning. Our government said that when they won the election, that they wouldn't make any changes to the tax changes. And at the time, you might remember it was phase 3, or there's a word for that, Mike, you'll know it. And they did make changes, and they had a few grizzles, and people were pretty upset about it. And it's fair to say that, that came and went. And as an electorate, we kind of got past that. A lot of people are feeling that their trust has been betrayed because our PM was very, very clear that negative gearing was off the table and there wouldn't be any changes. And that was a year ago. It's not that long ago. How do you think that will impact sentiment and, well, I guess voter sentiment going forward? And will that create a challenge for our current government?
I'll hand over to you first, Dave, because I jumped in on the.
I think there'll be a gradual building of a loss of trust. I think there'll be cohorts who it's going to take a while for them to realise how it's negatively impacted them. And I'm talking about people who previously voted Labor. And then the concept of the lack of trust will be talked about over and over in the media. That will then build in to the mentality of more and more voters. Right now, I don't think not until it plays out in the real world over time, but I think that will happen. I think as rents keep increasing, I think as the economy comes to a grind, because we got rates going up, I think they almost couldn't have picked a worse time to put this policy in place from an economic perspective in terms of what's happening economically, certainly from their dominance in government and 93 seats in the lower house, etc. It's a good, but I think in terms of what's happening in the economy, it's a shocking time. I think that along with breaking of trust, I think it's going to have a very big impact on them at the ballot box at the next election. How big? They've obviously got a large lead, and the Liberal Party is very dishevelled, and One Nation's rising. So, that's a whole other conversation. And we also have a different voting system to most democracies where you just vote. Most other democracies, like whoever you put first, that's who your vote goes towards. Whereas we have the, what's it called? Preferential system. So, yes, but I think it's going to have a negative impact. But I don't think it'll happen overnight, Cate. I think people will recognise it over time.
Well, they've weighed that up. They've given themselves a 2-year runway, and let's see how right they've got that.
I think that they should have given themselves a shorter runway. If they did it within 3 to 6 months of an election, they'll be better off. I think there's going to be more. They've given themselves a lot more time for all the negative outcomes to play out.
Yeah,
interesting.
I agree. Like, what's different this time is that we had 2 elections where we had a chance to vote on this as policy, and we voted no. And then we went to the ballot box again. They said they weren't going to change anything, and we voted yes. And then they've changed it on us. I think, like, we're used to being lied to by politicians, but this was a pretty big one. And I agree with Dave. It'll, like, in some respects, in 2 years, we'll forget that they lied to us. But in 2 years' time, we'll see the impacts of this policy change if it does become legislated. And home values and 70% of household wealth will be diminished, and I expect rents will be higher. I don't think there's going to be any winners. We're all going to be paying more tax than we were to fund the profligate spending that the government has been engaging in. So, yeah, look, I think people will have the shits right now, certainly, and as the data comes in, more of a case for that.
Can I just make one more point on that? Because bracket creep is the big one in Australia. We pay different rates of tax depending on where your income sits. And no government has legislated for the bracket of level of tax you pay to go up with inflation or wage rises. So what that means is we keep paying more and more tax as a nation as I just want to give you a quick example of how this happens without people realising. In 2020-23, the ALP's tax receipts was $260 billion. In 25-26, it's going to be around $315 billion. That's growth of 21.3% over those 3 years. So that is on annualized rate of 6.6%, which is twice the rate of inflation. So we are with this bracket creep and our income's going up, but when we jump into higher tax brackets, not increasing, the amount of tax we are paying as wage earners in Australia is growing at, over the last few years, double the rate of inflation. And this is just a big example of what's killing prosperity in Australia. They keep taking it away from our earnings.
On that joyous note, you can see why our mood is a little bit flat today. But to our loyal listeners, thanks for bearing with us. And we will be coming to you with more information as we glean the impact of these changes and get more information from the government, because as we've highlighted, there's a lot of gaps. And forgive us if we do sound a bit flat, because this is our world and our businesses are very interlinked with all of this as well. And we do our very best not to bring bias into the show, but we naturally do, because we're so passionate and it's such a big part of our lives. But we'll do our best to uncover the truth and the opportunity. And we look forward to bringing you market update next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Good to see
I'm
you guys.
actually not that flat, I must admit, but I just think it's going to grind the economy down and it's going to have a lot of negative impacts. And that isn't helpful, but, the world's always changing and we've got to adjust, and politicians do adjust if outcomes become too negative for too long.